I read Treasure Island properly for the first time when I was a teenager. My background, my childhood was very unbookish. My mum read a little bit, my father hardly at all. He used to say towards the end of his life that he reckoned he'd read half a book in his life, and it wasn't Treasure Island. So I certainly absorbed Treasure Island when I was a child, but I can't actually remember reading it then. But I certainly and very vividly remember reading it when I was sort of 16, 17. And what struck me then, and I don't mean to make myself sound too precocious about this, is that even though it is an incredibly good story, a real yarn, which of course is what he meant it to be, it's also full of surprising depths and emotional complexities of one kind or another that I think tend to get rather overlooked or underestimated in the appreciation of its driving narrative. So I've always had a slightly protective feeling about it in that sense, because I think it's even better than it's cracked up to be, as well as a simply admiring sense of it. Well, it's 40 years later, and this is very important to me, if to nobody else, but I hope, of course, important to other people as well, because what it allows me to say immediately is that even though this book is subtitled A Return to Treasure Island, and that is indeed what happens, it's not in a very strict sense a sequel. I think that sequels are very dangerous things to write for the very simple reason that they generally end up taking on the brilliant original at its own game, and you're likely to lose that if you take on something that is very starry in and of itself. We do meet Mr. Silver as he's become a rather respectable, very, very, very old man, a sort of vestige, a cobweb of a person, really. We meet him a couple of times, and we certainly hear a lot about the original adventure. And of course we do revisit the island, and we do there encounter the awful maroons who've been left there mouldering for all this time. But I wanted to write a story which was its own thing and wasn't sort of in hoc so much to the original.
Mr. Hawkins, the old man cawed as if he were a bird himself, and extended both his arms towards me. The idea that he might expect me to embrace him was something that filled me with revulsion, and I stood my ground, which of course he did not actually see. Mr. Hawkins, he said again in the same crooning tone. My boy, here's a treat for an old man. Come here and sit by me. Let me see you.
Well, the island is full of strange creatures that don't really exist. And I have really my daughter to blame or thank for this, because when I was beginning to write it, she said, "Where is this island, Dad? Is it near the Galapagos?" And I said, "Well, no, it's not really very near the Galapagos, but it is in more or less the same latitude as I imagine it." And she said, "Well, why don't you invent some creatures then?" So I then set myself to work to think about some imaginary animals, and I thought there was probably a large flightless bird which they were busily exterminating, so I made up one of them, a creature called the doodah, which they in some rather inept way farm, but mainly sort of brutalise and consume. This book should be serious fun. I mean, that should be the paradox that it embraces. So I've decided to have fun and invented a large squirrel that's sometimes, I mean, in its mature form is the size of a small pony, and blunders through the trees, breaking off little branches and generally kind of wreaking havoc.
What kind of scrape have you got us into here, you swab? Natty understood this to mean that she was the scrape and Stone was the swab, which hardly seemed fair, despite her loathing of him. I wish it had never happened, Captain. Just a lad, but a dangerous lad, seeing we don't know what comes along with him.
Give me the word and I'll tear out his tongue. That will make it start wagging soon enough.
If we tear out his tongue, how shall we ever hear what we want?
The audio version of this book is incredibly important to me. I might say that in an interview like this, mightn't I? But truly it is extremely important to me for two big reasons. One is that all my books, when I'm writing them, I read them aloud to myself, and a lot of my revising occurs as a result of this reading aloud. So the acoustic value of things, actually as part of the process of creation, has always been incredibly important to me. In the old days I used to dictate all my books and have somebody type them out, but now I just read them aloud to myself. So to have David Tennant do it, who is an absolutely perfect choice for this, because somewhere in the background of this, he's the right age, he's the right sort of figure in the sense that he's famously associated with a program which adults as well as children enjoy, so that's ideal for a book like Silver. But he's also Scottish, as was Stevenson. And even though the book is not narrated in a Scottish accent, I did have Scotland in the back of my mind when I was writing. And of course, there is one of the most important characters who appears in it is in fact called Scotland. So he's perfect for us, and I'm very pleased that he's done it.